Good afternoon and welcome to our panel on shared growth through inclusive innovation, sponsored by the Business Roundtable. I'm Alan Murray, the president of Fortune. This topic, I think, is one of the most important topics we face as a society over the next decade, and I'm very fortunate to be here with an all-star panel that has spent a lot of time thinking about it and studying it. Rich Lesser, who is the CEO of BCG, Zoe Baird, who is the president of the Markle Foundation, and my friend Mark Weinberger, they're all my friends, excuse me, who is the global chairman and CEO of EY. Thank you all for being here. So this whole notion of inclusive innovation is seen by some people as an oxymoron. When they hear about innovation, they think about self-driving cars and self-driving trucks that put taxi drivers and truck drivers out of work, or you think about natural language processing that puts young lawyers out of work, or AI that's going to put bank clerks out of work. What do we mean when we talk about inclusive innovation, and can business really make it work that way?
So I would say it's not just can business make it work, business needs to make it work that way. And I want to come at that from two angles. One is that we've looked a lot at what drives value creation in the long term. And there's this classic argument that says value creation is geared to shareholders or it's geared to other stakeholders, but it's mutually incompatible. You're one or the other. And we've taken deep looks with our shareholder, our value science practice, and looked in, and we found in multiple industries, if you actually look at the organizations that deliver value to non-traditional stakeholders beyond the investor community, that it actually reinforces value creation with shareholders, that we call it total societal impact.
That you can do both.
You can do both. Not just that you can do both, that one reinforces the other rather than one cuts against the other.
Yeah.
And that it's the responsibility of businesses, both in terms of a societal responsibility, but in terms of responsibility to their shareholder and investor community to think about how they create value across multiple stakeholders. And that directly gets to innovation and thinking about strategies that are integrated, not strategies of corporate social responsibility. That's very nice, there's nothing wrong with it, but that's not what we're talking about. Strategies that are in the core of the business that are aligned with the overall direction of the company, create a sense of purpose, create a set of new capabilities, often to serve lower income communities or provide inclusiveness or address environmental issues that can actually be reinforcing in other ways to the core business to deliver
So I'm going to
value.
come back to that in a minute and talk about how you do that, how you innovate in a way that does create inclusive growth, rather than exclude people. But first I want to go to Zoe and get your take on this, because I know you've paid a lot of attention to the training and workforce issues that rapid innovation of the kind we face today is raising.
Well, I think we're at a point, Alan, where people they've spent a lot of time analyzing the problem. Why is it that we have 7 million unfilled jobs in this country? Why is it that people use technology but they don't feel that they're sharing in the economic benefit of it? And we're now at a point where people are really ready to act and do something about it. We've been trying to press this agenda for a while, so we're really delighted that we've come to this point. And I think if you look at the transformation of work for the ordinary person, Sherrod Brown in his campaign talked about the dignity of work. For the ordinary person, there isn't an obvious path to get the training people need to participate in the present economy, to fill those 7 million jobs, to go after those 7 million jobs. And yet they believe, and we did a poll with Pew that showed that over 80% of Americans believe they need to get training throughout their lifetime to succeed. So we announced yesterday the Rework America Business Network with employers that represent 2.2 million American workers. And their commitment is to try to create transparency around the skills that people need for the jobs, to fill those jobs, regardless of whether someone got that skill in a next door neighbor's garage or in a job or through some kind of formal training. and then also to retrain their own workforce.
This is a really important point because in some ways the four-year college degree has ended up excluding a lot of people from the workplace who
Absolutely.
might have the skills needed to do jobs.
Well, absolutely, and people don't realize that almost 70% of Americans don't have
Don't
a
have
four-year
that,
college degree, and that's been true for decades. So we really have been increasingly erecting barriers. Right now, present job postings disproportionately call for a four-year college degree, even when the incumbents in those jobs have a very low percentage of four-year degree attainment. So there is a real transformation happening that's excluding a lot of
Yeah.
people, and we need to change that.
Mark, Rich made the argument that business needs to do this, needs to work towards inclusive innovation. But I would argue as a journalist who has covered business for some time that many of them don't. How do you create the incentives? How do you create the right structure so that business is incentivized to innovate in a way that creates more opportunity?
So great. And Alan, can I just follow up on one point Zoe raised and go right to that question if I
I
can?
am totally familiar with people not answering my
no,
questions. so
I'm
you
going to
can do
answer your
anything.
question, but Zoe's so spot on about creating opportunities. And we can't lose sight of what technology does do. It creates opportunities for whole new classes of people. It creates opportunities. You mentioned automated cars as a risk, and what will that do to jobs? But now blind people can get around. And you talk about disabled people with robotics that can do things that couldn't before. You think about, you go down a whole list of areas, even with recruiting, now you can recruit with algorithms to get rid of biases and stuff. So there's a lot of positive things that will bring people into the workforce. You got to look at both sides, and this is what I think employers are grappling with. Now, to your question, there's no doubt today that our license to lead as CEOs is at risk because of the lack of trust in business. And Rich, you hit on it. Basically, if you look just at innovation for shareholders, you have to do it as a business sense. But increasingly, businesses have to respond to all stakeholders, their employees, their communities, SDGs, we're hearing about the environment and all those things. And as you know, I got together with Lady Lynn Rothschild from the Coalition on Inclusive Capitalism, put together a group of 30 businesses, over $30 trillion in assets under management, who are all trying to figure out how do you calculate your return, businesses, to purpose, to your shareholders, to your communities, because it's so easily to financially measure something. And we've never had to look at these other areas. And frankly, financial measurements today do not even account for the value of most companies because they're looking at the balance sheet, so little of their assets are on that balance sheet. So what we've done is with technology and innovation, figured out how to use structured and unstructured data to be able to look at a company and see how their employees view the company through Global People Survey results, through Glassdoor and other types of surveys that are external, through data you pick up on the internet, and all of a sudden you could identify a culture through data and technology you couldn't before. And these are the way that businesses are increasingly are going to be held accountable, not just to your shareholders, to your employees, to your communities. You can calculate now with all this data that we have, the effect on society that you have of your emissions and things like that. That's really important.
Can you get shareholders to pay attention to those kinds of metrics?
Absolutely. In fact, most of the big issue has been short-term versus long-termism. Most shareholders want to think longer term. Most of us look, quarter to quarter at best because of the 24-hour news cycle. But increasingly, the asset owners and asset managers are saying, and you saw Larry Fink's letter talking about purpose, they're saying to be a sustainable long-term value creator, which is how I want to invest, I can't look quarter to quarter on financials. I want to know how sustainable your workforce is, how sustainable you are in the community, how much support you have in your customer base, how innovative you are, and those are things that you will now be able to calculate.
So, Rich, it's such an important point that in the long run, the interests of the shareholders and the interests of other stakeholders tend to converge. But in the short run, they often don't. I mean, I spent last year, it was the one opportunity I had to not just be a reporter, but actually sit inside the C-suite of a company. And I can talk about it because the company no longer exists. It was Time Inc. Yep. But I saw what happened at the end of the quarter and the kinds of decisions that were made when, for instance, you can improve your quarterly results by laying off people rather than, say, making the commitment to train them so that they can do the job that needs to be done 6 months or a year down the road. So what's the playbook here? How do we get people to think about this differently?
So if you're a CEO in today's world, you have to, from day one, figure out what's your medium to long-term value creation agenda, and you have to think in both senses. Where am I trying to get to? What's the end goal that I'm trying to get to? What is going to constitute winning 3 years out, 5 years out? And what's a roadmap to get there where I can bring investors and other stakeholders along in that journey? And I think sometimes CEOs, we've studied it. We find we see two patterns. The CEOs who have the right goal of what they're trying to get to, and they start too many things at once, and they start a zillion initiatives, and then they can't deliver, so they run into an executional challenge, right aspiration, where they want to go. But we also see the complacency trap, where you either are in or you've inherited as a new CEO, a successful organization, and you think you can sort of tinker at the margin, but keep it going. In today's world, there's just no
I wonder,
time. And the pressure to be thoughtful about longer term value creation and create a roadmap to bring investors along is really important.
I wonder if training is also an issue here as well. It seems like a lot of CEOs who came through traditional management training are experts at efficiency, figuring out how do I do what I do with fewer resources, rather than thinking about how do I create new value that's going to both redound to my shareholders and my workers and to society.
Can I just build on that? Because it actually brings us back to this theme about inclusiveness. One of the things we've observed in multiple studies is diversity drives innovation. And we started in Germany looking at gender diversity, and we found that companies that were in the top quartile of gender diversity had 19 points of greater innovation, if you define that as revenue from newer products, than companies that were median or below. But then we expanded to a multi-country study and across multiple measures, and what we found is organizations that create more diversity, of course in gender, but in nationality, in background, in different experiences, drive more innovation in their enterprises at a time where just simply driving for cost and efficiency aren't sufficient. And I think part of the challenge is not just the individual CEO lacking experience, but oftentimes in today's world we've had companies that have become sort of insular in the organization. Some of the insularity is the backgrounds of the individuals, some of the insularity is the experiences. And if you're trying to have a company win in the medium term, building diversity in leadership and in the organization is not just a nice to have you do so you get to give a nice presentation or give a talk. It's because you need the diversity to create the challenge in the organization, be ready to think differently about what the customer needs and how you're going to evolve the organization, and be innovative, which is the lifeblood of any long-term success.
Zoe, I want to go back to this training issue because it's so important. I mean, the surveys we do of CEOs uniformly find that they believe the next 10 years will see much more rapid innovation than they've seen in the last 10 years. And we know whole new sets of jobs are going to be created very quickly. And so part of it is creating growth that allows inclusiveness, but part of it is having people who can actually do the jobs. Is that the responsibility of the businesses, or is that the responsibility of government, the education system, whatever?
Well, I think there's no question but it's the responsibility of businesses, and I think your point about diversity is so true, both because the customer populations are radically different and diverse, and because the talent is so diverse that any company that doesn't take advantage of that is going to fail. I also think we're in a very high expectation, high consequence environment now. We've had, really since the Reagan era, the ability for businesses to kind of take the lead and push away things that they didn't feel was in their short-term interest. I mean, I've worked at GE and Aetna, and I've been on boards for many years, so I say this not just sitting in a nonprofit organization, but from my own experience. It used to be that companies retrained their workers as a matter of course. I recently had the experience sitting with a leading CEO involved with the World Economic Forum who, after hearing me, said, I just laid off 6,000 people to hire the 5,000 people with the skills I needed. What a mistake. I should have just retrained my workforce. I think we've gotten so far down the path of short-sightedness on the part of business that we are even missing when we might want to think longer term, retrain our workforce, invest in the people who've been invested in us, that we've just missed it because it hasn't been part of the discussion. So now I think we're really engaged in trying to transform labor markets, and to have that work for businesses, but to have it work for diverse people in communities who may or may not have a four-year college degree. And the thing that I'm seeing is that business leaders, governors are tremendously interested in this. We have a network of 20 governors who are deeply committed to transforming the labor market in their states. Now that requires them to work with business because that's who hires people, but it requires them to work with trainers and educators to train their workforce centers on what these jobs look like. So it really isn't just a matter of, is it the responsibility of business? It's a matter of how does business work with others in the community so that everyone is able to contribute their component of what's going to need to make this work for
but
people.
it does get back to the measurement issue. When you're talking about a CEO making the decision to lay people off instead of retraining them, if you lay them off, if you've got short-term shareholders who want to see the quarterly results, you lay them off, you put that all in a restructuring pool, you look better to your shareholders in the short term, whereas if you retrain them, that's an expense. It's not, you don't get any favorable tax treatment for it or anything, and that makes your quarterly results look worse. So it's hard, Mark.
Before you jump in, Mark, my pal here, so we can do this back and forth as we have many times. I just want to agree with you that there's no question but that we need to look at the policies that skew this in the wrong direction. But I would also say that when we've done surveys of CEOs, overwhelmingly, they appreciate, we did this with Time, in fact, not that long ago, overwhelmingly, they appreciate that they have dedicated workers who understand their company, who if they need some hard skills, they already have the soft skills, the company knowledge, the commitment to the company, and that it's a worthwhile investment. So I don't think that there's a singular answer to your question.
They need some support for shareholders.
Well, I'm going to follow up on Zoe's point before I get to, again, your question, which is going, because I think there's two issues. You got two really issues. 75% of our 270,000 people are millennials. We spend $500 million a year training our people. What I always say to our people is, younger people, when I do commencement addresses, is you're going to be in a job that doesn't exist today with technology that hasn't been invented yet, answering a question that we don't even know exists. And so how do you prepare for that? So there are two issues. One is in the workforce people today. You are going to have to retrain them. It's lifelong learning. It's no longer you come out of college, you know everything, you don't have to be retrained. It's going to be built into the budgets of businesses going forward. For us, it's an imperative. It's the strategic asset, our people, period. It's not because of quarterlies or financials or anything else. We have to do that. One other point, because I want to give the BRT a real applause here. They have an initiative that's going on around the country, along the lines you were talking about. I'm involved in the Greater Washington Partnership, one in the Washington area and one in the Raleigh area, where there's 10 or 12 businesses sitting down with the heads of the schools and the governors in the regions. And what we're doing is we're working on the curriculum in the schools. And if the schools will put this curriculum in place and the governments will help to fund them and make sure they're there, we will commit to hire certain people from them if they will take this curriculum, because that's the skills we need. So that's your point about business working with government, with the schools. The Roundtable is doing this in 10 or 12 different regions across the United States. We're going to get best practices and build that out across the country.
But Mark, we're all sitting here, you all agree this is an imperative, it has to happen. The Roundtable is supporting it, saying it has to happen. And yet, where are the shareholders on this? Because if you're running a business and you take that money and you put it into training instead of laying off the workers, it's going to make your quarterly results worse, and you're going to have some activists breathing down your neck.
But this is why increasingly, as a CEO, you have to be able to lay out your long-term strategy. You have KPIs that are going to get you there. This is the Larry Fink letter that I talked about before that's on, he's saying we're not going to invest in companies that don't show us their purpose and talk about what their role in the world is.
But I know some people who say that Larry says that in the letter, but that's not necessarily the way the investors.
Well, but wait, you may say that, but I'm telling you, this group of asset managers and asset owners that sat down for 18 months to work through solutions here all wanted to find out, how do you have actual information we can measure and assess across industry that we can use? Yeah. Right now, the problem is, there is none. Anybody can say whatever they want, and that's why you can't get asset owners to follow it.
But go ahead.
So I also want to say, I think you're framing it a little bit off, because I think even activists are focused on value creation. And then the question, if you're a CEO, is what constitutes value creation for your enterprise, and how do you articulate it in a way that people can get around
That's
it?
convincing
And
to the
That's
shareholders.
convincing. And some of it is getting the measures right. And I couldn't agree more with the theme that Mark and has picked up on here. But I also just want to say, learning and rapid learning organizations is not a nice to have in today's world. If you're the CEO and you don't think bringing people along to be able to learn new skills in a continuous way and building those capabilities is fundamental to your competitive advantage, you're missing
But
it.
Zoe,
But so Zoe's point, which is if you believe that knowledge is the source of your advantage, then you hire people who have knowledge. That's degrees and tons of. If you believe that the ability to learn and evolve and grow and adapt over time is your advantage, you can hire from a much broader range of people coming in that have the aptitude to do that, but don't necessarily come with a particular set of degrees from a particular
Rich, I agree
university.
with
And I think that that's part of the opportunity here to really
I
broaden the
agree with everything
inclusiveness.
you're saying, but Zoe, don't the numbers show that business spending on training has actually gone down, not up?
Well, it has, but I think that's going to turn. And, I would just say that the kind of companies that have joined our business network, and it's just a founding group, so I hope others will join. But it's being chaired by Boeing's head of human resources. And why are they interested? Because it's very hard to hire people to repair aircraft engines when they think that they're going to be using a wrench and they're going to be covered in grease. And once they see that, in fact, they're sitting at a computer terminal doing a diagnostic of an aircraft engine, and that they have been working in one particular area and with 1 to 2 semesters of community college and some training from Boeing, they're ready for that job, and it starts them on a whole new career path. Then people can get excited about it. And I think companies increasingly appreciate the importance of this issue because they can't get the workforce they need, and that inhibits growth.
So, Mark, if I'm a CEO and I'm hearing the message from Zoe and Rich and you that I have to create a learning organization, I have to be focused on the long term, and that's a critical part of my job. What are the metrics that I should be looking at rather than quarterly earnings?
Well, this is the difficult part because obviously every organization is different, so standardized metrics are hard to come up with. But remember, before the 1970s, or before we had financial metrics that are now part of our quarterly reporting and the 10Qs and the year-end financial statements, everybody just reported whatever they wanted on their financials. Then the government came in and said, we need to have standardized metrics so we can compare and make sure you're telling the truth and have someone outside assess that the information you're providing is accurate. Right now, we're at a point where everyone's talking about these issues, but there are no standardized metrics. And the next phase of this will be to come up with technology and innovation and now the data we have, some sort of standardized metrics to be able to look at and say, are you truly innovative as a company? Are you truly treating your talent the right way? And there are things. So we came up with this group that was market-based solutions to the answer to your question. We started with over 1,000 metrics in 4 areas, looking at talent, governance, innovation, and SDG, your commitments to society. Narrowed it down to 64 that all of these 30 different companies said they would continue to refine and look at to do the metrics. And it's in our book, Coalition for Inclusive Capitalism put it out, look on their website. It's called the Embankment Project. We have metrics for every one of these 4 things that didn't exist before, including a culture assessment survey, 10 questions that everyone said that's a good way to get a real clear view of what
your employees.
Yeah, you ask them and you get the response back and you have a snapshot of whether you think the culture you're driving is really there. There's lots of different ways to do it, Alan. This is a journey. And it's going to be a while before the government gets involved and thinks about how they're going to weigh in and say what should and should not be standardized. What could you stop reporting? Because you don't want to just layer on more responsibility on business, more reporting. But the true issue is, and if investors are looking at quarterly financials to make investments today, they are getting wholly the wrong information. They should be looking at strategic assets like workforce, like culture, like governance, like your communities, you affect your communities. And everybody knows that, they just can't measure it yet. That's the next leg of the journey.
So,
And
Rich,
by the way, if you're a CEO, you have a responsibility, even before there are measures that are broadly accepted, to figure out what will drive your long-term success, which means about how you build diversity, how you understand different stakeholders, how do you gear your strategy, and to engage your investor base in why you're doing what you're doing and how it pays off and what the roadmap looks like. And it will all be made easier and it will be made more consistent when we can have a broadly accepted set of measures. So the mission that the Inclusive Capital effort is pursuing is incredibly important. But that doesn't excuse a CEO in the years between now and then to figure out how they're going to make it
So
work.
you three are all very compelling on this issue, and you're optimistic on this issue, and I tend to want to be optimistic as well. But let me ask you, what happens if we don't get this right? What happens if we don't make this turn?
I feel like we're watching the implications of a society where some people feel really left behind. Rural versus urban, different ethnic minorities, the way women have often been cut out from having opportunity to advance in
Political
leadership.
breakdown.
And you see it in many different places. You're fraying at the society where already a lot of institutions are under pressure, and a lot of places we traditionally look to for cohesiveness have gotten frayed, and now you add this into it. I think that's not a good freedom to operate environment for a business.
You know, we've been saying for several years that our very democracy is at stake, but I don't think you need to look beyond, you know, the recent newspapers in France. You know, in France, 20% of the wealth is concentrated in the top 1%, and there are demonstrations in the street. In this country, it's 40%. So I think it's really an acute issue, and I think you combine that with the fact that we have an extraordinarily talented population that we're not deploying, that wants to be engaged in work and meaningful work, and we have companies unable to hire, and therefore their growth is impeded. I think we're at an inflection point where we're going to see really constructive action.
And I would say this is the so-called fourth industrial revolution. We've been through this 3 times before. We always figure a way through it to get to the other side. I'm not. It's coming faster than we've ever seen it, I think. But what you've really got here is the friction in going from where we are today to where we need to be. It's going to have a toll on a lot of people's lives who don't have these skills yet, and we got to get them reskilled real quickly. I think the issue is, and I started with before, is our license to lead these big organizations, government, business, whatever it might be, are at risk, because if people lose hope, they lose faith in the system, we're in trouble. I don't think that'll happen, I really don't, but I really honestly believe we have to figure out a way to help those that will not. Not everyone will make the transition. And so what do you do to help them through that period? And we as a government and business have to focus on that together.
This is a very complicated issue we've been talking about for the last half hour. There is no silver bullet answer to it, but unfortunately we have limited time. So if you could do one thing to help, one thing, what's at the top of your list? Quickly, Rich.
I think broadly taking on the diversity agenda in the broadest sense of the word. We've talked about it in many senses. Women, ethnic minorities, the disabled community, and really as leadership and as government working together to create environments that can attract and retain diverse communities, because I think it will foster innovation. I think it'll create stronger businesses, stronger society.
Hire people based on the equal dignity of whatever way they got their skills, in the neighbor's garage, community college, the last job they had, but be willing to look at a very broad and diverse
Look
group
at
of people.
skills, not
Look at
what-
skills rather than whether they've been in that job before or have a bachelor's degree.
Similar, I'd say expand the opportunity for education for all. Right now it's for too few, the people who can afford it, the people who live in the right big cities. Expand that opportunity to everybody, and we'll see if we have not 10% of the population experiencing in the GDP growth, but 50, 60, 70%, we'll grow that much faster and that much better.
Great. Well, thank you all three for a fabulous
Thank you,
discussion. Thanks to all of you for listening, and thanks to the Business Roundtable for convening this group. Thank you.